where we will be looking at deontology and finishing up discussing deontology, explaining it from our previous lecture, where I more or less just introduced some of the main and more important terms with deontology, as Immanuel Kant anyway has um, developed it. So let's go through a quick summary of what was discussed in the previous lecture. Immanuel Kant, 17th century, 18th century philosopher, thinks that the important thing to understand about morality is that morality really is a rationally derived or a rationally discovered, I should put it that way, rationally discovered thing. That what it is that people must do in order to figure out what the right answer to moral problems that is what they need to do to figure out those answers, is to indeed rationally determine what the morally right thing to do is. Um, so various aspects play a huge role in that particular theory of Kant's. Number one, the will. Remember, the will is that part of you that motivates actions. It's what you exercise in order for actions to happen, right, at your hand. Pun intended there, right? So your will does this. A good will, then, is a will that has been influenced solely by reason, right? In other words, a will that has only been informed by pure reason itself, by your reason alone, and not anything else, um, is going to make a will good, right? If reason alone influences the will would be good. And thus the actions that flow from that would be good. But the reason that they would be good would be because they've been influenced by a good will, or they've been motivated by a good will. That which is always at odds with reason is your inclinations, those temptations or desires or proclivities or what else, or whatever else that itself is not coming out of reason or rationality. If you remember, Kant thinks that happiness, for instance, is a very problematic thing to try to achieve. We try to use our reason to figure this out, but it doesn't do this very well. So we end up with uh, 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 times of trying to understand or times of trying to figure out what happiness actually is, or how to actually achieve it. And I remember Kant calls it happiness the sum total of all of our inclinations, and yet we are just not good at doing it, and so we end up in utter failure, right? Uh, the moral of the story for Kant then is inclinations are bad. They indeed will lead you to utter failure. Well, what's a duty? A duty is what you always ought to do no matter what. It is your ultimate priority or obligation that you should achieve, that you should actually perform. And it's through reason that you discover what your duties are. And then when reason sends that information to your will to perform those duties, and your will actually then follows through on that and performs those through action, well, then your will becomes good. That's how you develop a good will. A maxim is a sort of rule or a hypothesis that you would test in order to see whether or not it could be uh, whether or not rationality or reason itself um, uh, would send that onto your will. Okay, it's some statement regarding some moral practice or action that we need to test in order to figure out if it would indeed make our will good. Okay, and we're going to spend some time in this lecture talking about what that is for Kant. And then, of course, there's the categorical imperative, which is the ultimate rule or the ultimate model of morality. It's really the sort of the recipe, if we want to put it that way, for doing morality and for becoming moral people, for figuring out what our duties are. The categorical imperative is this major tool that we have to use in order to achieve that. Remember then that here, as we are summarizing, remembering what we talked about when we talked about the moral struggle, is that it's always the struggle between two different opposing forces that are trying to control your will. It's reason or it's inclinations. And so the moral struggle is always the struggle between allowing either our inclinations or reason itself to influence our will and thus motivate our actions, uh, thus cause us to act in certain kinds of ways. So let's talk about the categorical imperative. I've already talked about it as Kant thinks about it as this sort of ultimate recipe or model or ultimate tool, perfect tool that we would use in order to figure out if our uh, possible moral actions or our maxims, right, that we want to test to see whether or not we should actually perform them, that we'll use in order to figure that out. So the categorical imperative, however, for Kant is very interesting, okay, because it's not that intuitive to us, to most students, that it should have such a high place uh, in his theory. Sometimes you kind of feel caught out of left field, and if you feel that way right now, that's totally okay. That's fine. I understand that. That is very normal, because here's what the maxim is: act only, or this is what the categorical imperative is: act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And so you're thinking right now, how is this the gold standard for Kant? How is this like the tool that I'm supposed to use in order to um, figure out what actions are morally good, and which ones are morally bad? Furthermore, you're thinking, Dr. Ball, why are you calling this categorical imperative formulation one? Well, the reason I am is because Kant thinks that there are different formulations of the categorical imperative that pretty much all say the same thing, or different ways of formulating some of this ultimate principle. And sure, we can kind of see in this then that Kant seems to be pretty arbitrary in the sort of what he's pointing out here. And that's maybe a fair criticism. We won't spend the lecture delving into these criticisms, because we just want to understand his theory at this point, understand him as best as we can, what he's actually saying, and then we can do our reflection and critical work later, once we understand him as best as we can. So let's just go with it. For the sake of today, let's just go with this and just try to understand it. So this first formulation is, I'll repeat it again: act on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So how would we use this? How would I use this to figure out my duties, to determine? So reason is going to take this categorical imperative formulation, and then I'm going to, through reason, through the sort of reasoning I'll do in my head, I'll apply this to a situation in order to try to figure out what my duties are. And here's a sort of process then by which we figure this out. First of all, we're going to identify a maxim, and a maxim can be any sort of right hypothesis on how to act. Uh, I go across the street and I buy a sandwich, and I get too much change back. Right? I give them a 20, and maybe the sandwich was $10, and they give me $15 back. Well, they gave me $5 too much back. So at this point, I'm got a problem. I'd like to keep the $5. I know that's coming out of my inclinations, right? Or I could do the honest thing and give it back. So I need to come up with a maxim that is a hypothesis. So maybe my hypothesis is that in this situation where I'm given too much money back, I will keep the money um, instead of letting the cashier know that what happened and then give the money back. Right. So I've got this hypothesis that this is what I'm going to do, and I just put that hypothesis out there. So I've identified this maxim, this hypothesis, and then I'm going to see if I can will it universally. Now, it's kind of interesting to think about what this means exactly. And this can be a confusing part of the formulation. What does Kant mean when he says that I should act only on these maxims that I could will become universal? And by maxim, or by willing this universally, again, this is what I'm doing in my reasoning. I'm considering whether or not this can be done before I actually act on this maxim or not act on the maxim. I'm doing this reasoning work. Well, so I've got to think in my head, does the maxim itself defeat or undermine itself? Is there a way in which to will this particular hypothesis or maxim about keeping the money instead of giving it back, does it do some sort of, does it bring some sort of undermining to this concept, maybe of honesty or of transparency, by which my maxim is relying on? The other side of that coin then, as I have to ask this question, would this maxim itself be inconsistent, maybe due to a contradiction of what I'm actually willing, right? Am I wanting something for myself, maybe that I'm not for this cashier that I'm dealing with in this particular situation? So these are the sorts of questions I'm going to see whether or not this maxim can be willed universally. If the answer is no, that it can't be willed universally, this hypothesis maxim I put out there about keeping the money, well, I've discovered a negative duty. That is a duty to never do what this maxim actually says to do or tells me to do. But if the answer is yes, that it can be willed universally, then I've discovered a positive duty, something that I indeed should do always, with no exception. Okay, this is how rigid Kant's theory is. We get a situation when we figure out duties like this, or figure out negative duties, things that we should never do. And so then, if the answer is yes, or I guess no, but here specifically yes, I should adopt it. Right? Of course, the other side of that is I should adopt not doing it if it's a negative duty. But if it's a positive duty, I should adopt it. And thus, in any situation, I will do this maxim, or I will perform what this maxim says, what this hypothesis says, simply because it is my duty. All right, so I'll identify the maxim, see if I can will it universally. If I can't, then I've discovered a negative duty. If I can will it universally, then I found a positive duty. And then once I found that positive duty, then I adopt that duty. I will always inform my will of that duty simply because it is my duty. And thus I will perform that duty. So let's take this rule, this categorical imperative formulation 1, and let's apply it to some examples. Okay? So what we will do now is we will use some of the examples that Kant himself gives in his own explication of his theory. So let's say, first of all, let's use his example of suicide here. So some people ask sometimes, is suicide morally right or wrong? Is it the case that people have a right to end their own lives, or is it not the case? That is, that people do not have a right whatsoever to end their own lives whenever they want to. This is an interesting debate in American society and has been for several years, and I'm sure will continue to be, regarding physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia in end-of-life matters. For instance, there are several states in the country right now that allow for legalized suicide if someone has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and they would rather end their life instead of going through with the treatment or going through with the suffering of death. Then in certain states, doctors can prescribe barbiturates to those patients that they can go to the pharmacy and get and take it home, and then and that will end their lives. That will indeed kill them. So, is that morally right or wrong? It's a big question. So, what is the maxim here that we need to test? Kant thinks it's this one, that when I am unhappy, I will kill myself out of self-love to end my sufferings. Let's think about this for a second, because you might say, well, this is kind of a weird way to put it. But I would argue that this is actually pretty accurate, I think, at least in uh, the debate regarding assisted suicide and euthanasia. The idea here is that if someone has been diagnosed with a terminal illness with very little hope that they could recover from it, and very little hope that they could actually even extend their life to have however they define a high quality of life to be through that process. So there's some unhappiness there, there's some frustration, there's really little hope. And so because I love myself, because I care about my life and the life that I live, it would just be better for me to end the life rather than live a suffering life. So out of my own love for myself, I should indeed just end myself. So that's the idea of what's going on with this particular maxim. So the question here, right? So we're going to use the categorical imperative. Can I rationally will this universally? In other words, can I turn this principle of self-destruction out of self-love into a universal law that I can rationally will? In other words, can I will this universally so that not only myself, but others, but also conceptually universally, does this work itself out? And of course, Kant answers and he says, well, no, this doesn't pass the categorical imperative test because there's an inherent inconsistency in this maxim. Because what I'm wanting are two opposites. I'm wanting death and self-preservation. In other words, when saying that I'm killing myself out of self-love in this maxim, the idea here is that I am in a sense preserving myself, or I'm preserving the integrity of myself by ending myself. And so what I'm doing is contradicting my will. I'm wanting to get one thing out of the other, and that's irrational, right? That's a problem. So because it's irrational, then this doesn't pass the test. It's not the case that I have a duty to kill myself out of self-love to end my sufferings. Indeed, for Kant, this would be the discovery of a negative duty. I should never actually do this because it's irrational. It goes against reason. So if ever I am tempted to do this, this would be inclinations talking. Reason would never come up with this, right? Reason, pure reason itself would never send this memo to my will. It's the inclinations that would do that. Well, how about a different example? And maybe this one might be a little more obvious. I think students, or I say obvious, this might be less obvious, but the explanation here might be more helpful in understanding how this works once we go through it. This was one of Kant's favorite examples. Something like this. When I need money, I will lie in order to get the money that I need. So let me give you an example here. Let's say that right, I'm renting a house to live in, let's say, and um, I got paid. It's about the first of the month, so I got paid last week, and I really like my paycheck. But I am just, I don't know, I got really stupid, and I blew all of my money on Pokemon cards. Um, yeah, I know that's a blast from the past, isn't it? But but the whole paycheck went out the window. Pokemon cards all over the place, all over my house. Right? I went to the Pokemon convention and I just blew it all. Well, here's the thing though. I've got to pay rent, and I blew all my money on other stuff besides rent. So I've got to figure out what indeed I'm going to do here. So here's what I do. I go to my landlord and I say, hey man, I had some unexpected bills come up, and I promise you, I'll get you that money in 2 weeks. I'll have it for you in 2 weeks. Um, if you can just hold off and do that, then I should be able to come up with it. And the landlord says, well, that sucks. I really want my money. But okay, I mean, if you'll have it in 2 weeks, that's fine. We can do that. No problem. No penalty. Let's just get it to me in 2 weeks. And I'm like, great. Shake his hand and go off on my merry way. Now I get paid monthly, so I'm not going to have any more money in 2 weeks. However, a week after that, I'll get my paycheck for the next month, and then I should be able to do it. So what I've done here is I've false promised him, knowing that I'm not going to come up with it in 2 weeks, knowing that when he comes to me and says, hey, where's my money? I'll be like, oh crap, I don't get paid until the end of the month, which at that point will be the week after. So at that point, we'll be even closer to him getting paid, right? It'll be just a week away, and then I'll just say, well, I just need one more week, then I'll get my paycheck. And surely he won't throw me out within a week when he knows he'll be able to get rent, right, the week after. So here's what I've done is I need some time here. I need money. Um, and in this sense, what I have done is I have lied about all of this in order to get it, right? In order to figure out uh, how to make rent happen, or how to get rent paid um, by the end of the month. Um, or even a different example, which might be a little more simpler, really, as I think about it here, is just going to somebody and telling them, hey, can I borrow some money? I'll pay you back tomorrow, and not intending to pay them back tomorrow. I need money. I'm going to lie to this person, give them a big old story in order to get the money that I need. And so in this case, right, I'm lying to them and I am promising falsely what it is that I'm actually going to do, right, in both cases. So the question then is, this particular maxim is relying on a principle. This hypothesis is relying on a principle of false promising, of lying when I make a promise. So can that be turned into a universal law that I could rationally will, that my reason would come up with to will rationally? And would it pass that test? Again, because this is what the categorical imperative commands me to do, or says that I should do. And for Kant, the answer is no. And here's why it's no. Here's why that I can't will this universally. It's because to will it universally would mean I would need to will lying or dishonesty universally. But especially in this case, I can't do that because I need him, I need my landlord, or I need the person I'm borrowing money from to assume honesty. I need them to be honest. I need them to be expecting honesty. And at the same time, I need to be wanting or exercising dishonesty from me. So I need both. I need Me to be dishonest, I need them to assume honesty. So I'm needing two contradictions here in order for this to work. It can't be the case that I can will dishonesty for everybody. That wouldn't work for my purposes here. If I'm being dishonest and I'm expecting the person I'm borrowing money from to expect or to assume dishonesty, then I'm not going to get the money that I need. So the maxim itself wouldn't even be able to work practically. So what I need is a contradiction. I need to will a contradiction out there in the world. And that contradiction is dishonesty on my part and honesty, or the assumption or presumption of honesty on their part. So because I'm contradicting my will here, this is irrational. And thus the maxim fails the test. Right? It's not something that I could will universally in order to get the ends that I'm trying to get there. What about this one that Kant mentions? When I don't need to, I'm not going to work. I'm not going to develop my talents so that I may obtain an easy life. I want to get an easy life, so I'm not going to work and I'm not going to do anything else. So the question then here with this maxim is this principle of laziness that I am assuming here. Can I turn that principle into a universal law that I can rationally will? In other words, then, could I will this universally across the board for everybody in the universe and it rationally work itself out? And of course, no, that's not the case. Because if I'm going to have an easy life, somebody's got to do the hard work to secure an easy life. So I'm wanting laziness for me, but I'm wanting everybody else to be productive so that my life can be very easy of laying around on the couch watching Netflix, playing on my phone, and eating good food. Well, there's going to have to be productive people out there making the couches, uh, coming up with the programming for Netflix. um, Farmers out there making the tasty food that I'm going to eat while I'm hanging out on this couch and being lazy, right? So I need everyone else to be productive so that I can be lazy. So I'm wanting a contradiction here. I'm wanting laziness from me, productivity from everyone else. That's a contradiction. So that doesn't pass the test. Well, what is it that all of this kind of shows maybe about ourselves? And for Kant, it's this, that when indeed we are tempted to and actually do break the duties that we have, that is what reason informs us of and demands of us, it's usually because we want to make an exception for ourselves in order to satisfy some inclination. That's why lying is a negative duty. You should never do that. That's why suicide is a negative duty. You should never do that. That's why laziness is a negative duty. Right? It's something you should never do. And I think the laziness and the honesty is a little bit more obvious here, a little bit more easier to understand how this works, is because those are the sorts of things that we really don't want everybody doing. We don't want it to be universal across the board, do we? We can't want that, or else we're not getting what we want to satisfy the inclination that we have here. So the breaking of duties really is a very selfish sort of thing that we do in order to satisfy some kind of desire that we have about something. So Kant's argument here then is really not about the effects of my actions. In other words, morality itself is really not touched whatsoever, is not affected whatsoever by what my actions actually accomplish. That is what their effects are. It's not about whether or not my actions or my desires or decisions are prudent. That is, whether they are sort of meet the demands of prudence in my culture. Rather, it's all about what reason itself can will without contradicting itself. It's all about what reason itself can come up with and send on to the will without inclinations throwing things in there to make exceptions for myself, right? And thus those exceptions bring about contradictions because those exceptions necessarily, right, um, uh, by their own definition, don't allow those maxims themselves to be universal. So I can never will anything universally if my inclinations are involved, because inclinations are wanting to make exceptions for me. So it's irrational to ask my own reason, to ask my reasoning capacities, then to adopt as its own rule for operating something that's against reason. It's irrational to expect my reason to go to the inclinations then and say, hey, throw in some data here to the will that's going to be anti-reason, right? That's just irrational by definition. And thus the other side of that coin is that it's irrational then to ask reason to adopt as its rule the destruction of reason, which is what it would be if it indeed did that. So pure reason, coming up with, testing these maxims by the categorical imperative test, right? That really important tool for examining these maxims or examining these hypotheses. We can put it that way, for how we maybe should act or should not act. We're going to test it to see that. Um, um, that reason does that, and then it spits out the result. When reason is on its own figuring that out, spits out the result that will always work, and that is always rational, right? So long as the inclinations are not involved. That's the first formulation of the categorical imperative. The second formulation of the categorical imperative, again, Kant thinks that this is sort of the other side of that same coin. It does say something different, but he thinks that this is pretty much all the same idea. Don't get hung up on that. We don't want to spend our entire course trying to tease this out. Let's just take him at his word to try to understand his theory here. And this formulation number two is this one: that again, not only should you act in such a way that only act on those maxims that you can will universally, but you should also act according to this formulation in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in any other person, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. So always treat people as ends, not merely as means. Let me give you an example of what that means, okay? So it's true that we all treat each other as a means to some other end. That's just a fact of life. You are a student. Right now, you are treating me, your ethics professor, um, as someone who can help you get a degree or help you get a grade for this class, right? You are using me like a dish rag just to get through your program, right? I know it, right? I get that. I understand. It's okay. Um, uh, I could argue that it's the same thing the other way around, that I'm using you as a dish rag to get a paycheck at the end of every month, right? So we're using each other here. But here's the difference, or at least I hope that this is true of all of us involved in this course, that we're never treating each other merely as a means. By that I mean you're never treating me merely for the sake of getting out of me what's going to benefit you, and then when the course is over, you're going to come and kill me or something like that. You don't need me anymore, so mobster style. I can't use you no more. So then you just shoot me and I die. Put me in the back of a Cadillac or something and throw me off into the harbor. No, please do not do that. I beg of you not to. That would be a good example, however, of treating me merely as a means, right? You're just using me for what you can get out of me, and then when you're done with me, I mean, literally, you're done with me. You off me, as the mobsters put it, or at least in the movies, that's how they put it. No, you treat me as an ends, that I have integrity, that I have value, that I have intrinsic value, um, merely in being a rational, autonomous person. And likewise, that's the case. Um, Once I get my paycheck due to you, I'm not going to off you. Take joy and comfort in knowing that here today, that I have no desire to do that whatsoever, and that will not happen. Uh, I will treat you as a person, as a means that has intrinsic value, as an ends, that is, as a goal, as an ends in and of yourself, that you have intrinsic value, and will always have intrinsic value in that way. So this is how we should treat one another. And for Kant, this indeed is the case because um, because of our capacity that we have for rationality, that's an end in itself. Remember, this rationality that influences the will, right? This will that has been influenced solely by reason itself is the highest good that there is. And so if a person has the capacity for doing that, or put it this way, if a creature has the capacity for doing that, then that particular creature has intrinsic value. This is why Kant then wants to really think about people themselves as having this kind of value above animals, or even above and beyond humans that have cognitive or mental defects. He ultimately concludes that people with those kinds of, and this is where it gets controversial with Kant, and we don't necessarily have to go down this road and get hung up here, but this is why it's controversial, is because he would say that some people with certain kinds of mental or cognitive impairments or defects are really not persons, that they indeed would be more like animals here because they don't have the capacity for rationality. They just don't have it. They can't exercise it. People who do are autonomous, rational creatures, since rationality makes the will good. It's that capacity that people have that ought to be respected. If someone has the capacity to have a good will, not everybody does. Some people just suck at it. But having that potential, having that capacity is what demands human respect. That's what brings about human value, is that. It's not just that they're instrumentally valued. In other words, I'm not just using the person up here at Subway as an instrument to make me a sandwich, and then I off them once my sandwich is made, right? I'm not using them as a mere instrument to other things. I am doing that, frankly. I mean, I am using them. I'm paying them for their services. I'm using them to get something I want, but I'm at the same time treating them as an ends in themselves, as something that has intrinsic value and integrity. So what happens when a maxim fails this particular test, this test about treating people not merely as a means but as an ends? As Kant puts it, there's different ways that this fails. It may be that in that maxim, I'm really treating myself as a means to something not rational. So think about those examples we looked at regarding the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Things like pleasure or suicide, laziness, lying, killing, right? All these kinds of things are examples of me just using myself to accomplish something that's irrational, right? So that can be the case as well, right? So the second formulation about always treating someone as an ends and never merely as a means, that doesn't just apply to you and how you treat other people. It applies to you also in how you treat yourself, because you have to think about yourself as an autonomous creature with the capacity for cultivating a good will. And thus, you need to respect your own human integrity, your own human value. Or it may be the case that it's the other way around. Maybe this is why the maxim fails this particular test. I'm treating myself as an end, right, but not others, right? This is classic narcissism. This is classic self-aggrandizement and self-indulgence, however you want to put it, right? Just being self-centered. Is that right? I am all that matters in the world, and so everybody else is just a tool for me to get what I want for myself. Or it may be the case that the reason why this maxim fails in my life is because, let's say that I impose an end on other people, sort of guilt my buddy into helping me out of a problem that I'm having. Um, I'm sorry, that problem. Yeah, sorry, I got confused with my own writing here. That that I guilt my buddy into helping me out of a problem that I'm having, and the reason that I guilt them into doing that um, uh, is because, well, I really want it for myself. I need their help, so I'm manipulating them by lying to them about a situation, right, to get them to help me out. Um, so what I'm doing by lying is that I'm manipulating them, and in a sense, what I'm doing is controlling them. And I am then precluding or refusing to allow them to make that decision for themselves on whether or not they want to help me out. It's through manipulating and controlling them then that I'm not respecting them. I'm not respecting their rational autonomy. I'm not respecting their own human value. And I'm trying to control them myself. And I do that through lying to them. I do that through telling a big story and not telling them the truth. So I'm manipulating and controlling them. I'm treating them as a means for me to get what I want and not as an ends in and of themselves. Now, there have been some problems that have been pointed out about Kant's theory and whether or not it's all that cogent. It indeed has been very influential. It's very popular. It's very popular, believe it or not. I think one of the ways in which you see how popular it is in how sort of the basic idea itself is practiced in American law. It has been said, the late legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin um, really had spent a lot of his scholarly career talking about how the high courts, such as the United States Supreme Court, is very Kantian in how it approaches the resolution of legal problems, and how it infuses morality itself sort of arbitrarily into a lot of the legal decisions that it makes. It's very Kantian in that way. Or I'm sorry, it imposed a lot of Kantianism in those decisions that it's doing, try to finding out what's rational, and thus its rationality itself trying to be, imposing laws where laws were never actually created by legislatures, but it imposes them because it thinks that it has to in order to make everything consistent, to make the body of law consistent, right? And that is to make it coherent, right? Consistent with itself, which is huge for Kant, right? Consistency in morality, that's what matters. Whenever you have a conflict, then that's a failure of a maxim, and you can't have that. So it's influential in that way. What are some of the problems, though, with it? Um, well, there's a few criticisms that have been leveled against Kant's deontology. First of all, that it's not very effective in solving conflicts between duties. Let's say between two different duties. What should you do if you indeed have this tension? One of the examples that Kant himself gives is this example that I will modify for our purposes, and it goes something like this. Um, you're hanging out in your apartment. It's a nice day. You got the windows open. I don't know. You're cooking up something good on the stove. It's like a Saturday afternoon. You're off. It's just a nice day. All of a sudden, there's this banging on your door, and you open your door, and it's a really good friend of yours who says, there's a murderer that is after me, and they are going to kill me. Will you please hide me in my closet? And so, if you're a Kantian, you do this really quick, instant reasoning going on to see if what maxim would you could universally will that treats your friend as an end and not merely as a means, and you discover that indeed you have a duty to help people, especially to protect their life or save their life. So you're like, okay, yeah, go hide in my bedroom closet and you'll be fine in there. So they do that, and they're hanging out there, and you go back to your Saturday afternoon. 15 minutes later, there's some more banging on your door. So you open up the door, and the murderer is standing there, and he says, "Hi, I'm the murderer. I am here to murder your friend. Um, is your friend here in your apartment?" Well, now you've got a real problem, because you do have a duty to help preserve other people's lives, to treat them as an ends and not merely as a means. But remember, especially regarding the first formulation, you have a duty to tell the truth, because to lie is indeed to make an exception for yourself regarding what rationality itself demands. So it seems like you indeed have a duty to do both things, but at the same time, we've got a problem, because it seems like both things are problematic, right? You want to save your friend's life. So what do you do? And here's how Kant responds to that, which a lot of people think is not very helpful. Kant says you indeed always have a duty to tell the truth. So in this way, you should tell the truth. You always should tell the truth. Um, at the same time, you'll be like, but if I tell the truth, my friend is going to end up being murdered. And Kant says, well, tough luck. If this person takes the truth and does something morally wrong with it, it's on them. It's not on you. You've done your duty. You've done your job. You've been an honest person. So if they're going to use that to do something wrong, then the blood is on their hands, right? They are morally culpable, not you. Um, well, that's not a very satisfying answer, is it, right? So it seems easy for Kant to say that both are absolute duties and you should do them and not worry about the consequences. But we do worry about the consequences, frankly, right? We tend to prioritize and say that in a case like that, lying is going to be great. Lying is the way to go about it, because surely it's way more important to preserve someone's life than it is to tell the truth about where they are to someone who wants to bring harm to them. Okay, this is the problem that we see with trolley. This is where things get kind of difficult, right? In trying to solve trolley, is there's all kinds of duties you might think that we have to perform there to preserve life as much as possible. At the same time, to not actively take someone's life, which is what you're doing if you pull the switch on the trolley. So there's some issues here regarding how to solve conflicts that one has between duties. Another problem that people raise is that, or some philosophers will raise, is that it seems to not really offer a principled way to consistently craft the maxims that we would be testing in order to see whether or not they pass the categorical imperative test. And this is what often philosophers will talk about as the problem of generality regarding moral maxims, because you can make them so specific that they're not really self-defeating or inconsistent, but would still go against our moral intuitions, right? And you can make them more general to make them more easier to answer as well. So how general should you get with them? How specific should you get with them? Here's an example. Murder is wrong unless it's the killing of poor people on the government dole. Um, yeah, that seems to be problematic for lots of reasons. But at the same time, this would seemingly pass Kant's test, and that's the problem here. This would seemingly meet the categorical formula, the categorical imperative formulation number one, and pass it with flying colors because it's something that could be universally willed. In other words, I'm not making an exception here for myself. Although there is an exception being made regarding the application of murder, I suppose. But again, that's what's going to have to be argued here, right? So this is tough. A third principle, and this is the final, or our third problem, and this is the final one that I want to talk about, the final slide for today's lecture. It has to do with pitfalls with the principle of means and ends themselves. So this indeed has to do with the second formulation of the categorical imperative. I mean, it kind of makes sense when we talk about, treat other people not merely as means, but also as ends. But is that really right? Because we can think of examples where indeed we would have to use people merely as means in order to save ourselves to some extent. Let me give you an example. Every now and then we get a big scare around the world regarding the Ebola virus. It's an extremely deadly virus. I think it's a little bit harder to contract than others, but if you contract it, my goodness, I mean, it's fatal, right? People generally don't recover from this. Not to say that there are no recoveries, there are, but they're few and far between. So think about people who contract Ebola. What we do regarding public health in the United States, which I think there's only ever been just a couple cases here where people have brought it here, or maybe just the one that I'm thinking of a couple years ago. But anyway, right, they have to be quarantined. And so enforcing someone to be quarantined against their will because they have Ebola is a way in which we as the general public use them. We're using them by forcing them, by manipulating them against their will to be quarantined so that we can be safe and sound, so that we can have a normal social life, so that our economy can go on as normal as usual. In other words, we have to be very paternalistic over them in order that our society can flourish and do well. That would seem to be necessary for our society. At the same time, that would completely violate Kant's second formulation, where he says always, without exception, right? There's no exceptions here. Always treat others as ends and not merely as means. To force someone in quarantine would mean that you're not really respecting their human value and integrity. You're not allowing them to live their lives. You're forcing them to live the life that you want for them, which is four walls in a plastic bubble with no air exchange between them and the rest of society. So that seems to be a problem, right, with Kant's formulation. Necessarily, we need them quarantined, but again, it seemed to violate their own human value and integrity. So anyway, that's all I got for this lecture. Be thinking about this, reflecting on it. Watch this more than once to help you understand what's going on with Kant's deontology and some of the issues that are worth thinking about in response to it.